Salve GBA fans, it's Xilicks here, and welcome back to some more of the GBA Fantasy League. This is week 6, and we've come quite a long way, so thank you to everyone who has stuck around and continued making picks. An update on the mid-season recap, review, whatever you want to call it, that should most likely be coming next week, after week 6 is complete, in the week 7 video. If it doesn't, I will update you guys on it then, but we're essentially just going to be totaling up a lot of the points that the Mons have gotten and a lot of the points that the players have gotten, so you guys can see how well you've been doing compared to other players, and you can see the stats of some of the Mons from all the weeks up to that point. And then we'll probably have another review at the end of the season. So yeah, let's get right into the video with the last week recap. Starting up our last week recap, we have our top player, who was Jang Moo Fet, clever name by the way, scoring pretty good 54 points. We have our all-star, which is defensive Slowbro. This is the first defensive all-star in the GBA Fantasy League history, which is pretty cool. It's been a bunch of offensive all-stars up to this point, but now we have defensive Slowbro scoring 22 points. And if anyone picked it as their all-star, they would get 27, although also nobody picked Slowbro as their all-star, so that's a fun fact. Moving on to our Coach of the Week, we have a tie once again with the Florida Gators and the San Diego Chim Chargers. So again, my awful Photoshop skills, I mix up the logos. Take it as you will, but they both scored a 5-0 victory, meaning if anyone picked them as their Coach of the Week, they scored 8 points. Moving over to the GBA Fan document created by the one, the only Dallas Staryu. Over on the left part of the page, we have our coaches and how many points all of them scored. We have our all-star, so as you can see, if you pick the all-star, you get 27. We have my pick 6 from the last week. I scored 37 points, so if you got higher than that, then you beat me last week. Moving on to our offensive and defensive rankings from last week, we have a surprising Tapu Fini at the lead of the offensive rankings, and we also have Victini and Kabutops in the top 3. Moving on to the defensive side, we have our all-star Slowbro, Serena, and Slowking all scoring a pretty good amount of defensive points. We see 2 Regenerator Mons up at the top there, and also 2 Mons from the Detroit Steel Wings, so very defensive match. Moving right along to your points, this can be found on the fantasy sheet linked below in the description. We see at the top we have Jang Moo Fet, who picked the Coach of the Week and also picked, I believe, Slowbro not as the all-star but as one of their defensive picks. And if you scroll all the way to the right side, you can see your total. Use Control F or Command F for Mac users to search up your name to see how many points you got. Heading on over to the You Pick 6 section of this week, just a reminder, you guys can make your picks down below in the description. Click on the Week 6 form, fill that out to make your picks. And these are my picks for this week. You don't have to follow them, although you can use them as a guide if you please. Our first pick is going to be offensive Duck Trio from the Philadelphia Scissors versus the Tampa Bay Lux Rays. Mono's team has quite a few ground weaknesses, and I'm sure that Chimpax will be able to capitalize on those weaknesses with Duck Trio. We saw that Duck Trio did get quite a few kills in week 2, and again, it did pretty well in weeks 4 and 5. Mono is a pretty good coach though, so I imagine that he'll have a few tricks up his sleeve, but Chimpact is also a very skilled battler, so it'll be interesting to see how it goes with Duck Trio on the Scissors team if it gets brought. Moving on to Mamoswine. Listen, Tom, if you're listening, I've succumbed to the peer pressure. All the commenters, all the fans in the fan Discord, they all just keep picking Mamoswine, and I just couldn't refuse it this week. I cracked under the pressure. I picked Mamoswine. The Arcaniners have a huge Mamo weakness. Now, obviously, a lot of teams on paper are weak to Mamoswine. That's just like how Draft League works. If you draft a team, you're probably weak to Mamoswine. But usually it gets played around, and the Arcaniners do have a pretty solid switch in with Suicune. but it's just so good this week, I could not pass it up. It's probably going to get bodied on the second turn, and all the hype is just going to come crashing down without the icicles. I tried to make a pun, it was bad. Look, again, Tom, if you're listening, I'm sorry. It's probably going to get like bodied, and Mamo's not going to get any points, and you'll be right. But you know what? I'm picking it. I'm picking it. So, moving on to Xurkitree. This mon is honestly really weird, in my opinion. Like, I don't know. Like, Steve does pretty well with Xurkitree, right? He hasn't really, like, fully swept any teams with it, but it always manages to get some kills. Not always, but I think this week, though, against the Giantes, it has a good matchup, because we've seen in the past that the Giantes have been very weak to electric types, and this week isn't really an exception to that. They do have some adjustments made, some trades, add drops to mend that weakness. However, the Sawsbucks have ways of breaking those mons down, making room for a potential late game Xurkitree sweep with the aid of a Z Crystal. Moving on to the defensive picks that I have for this week. Starting off, I have Rotom Heat. Now, this mon is a bit of a staple pick for me. I've picked it a few times in the past, and I just really like Rotom Heat as a defensive pick. It has plenty of ways of status. It's weak to enough types, resists enough types to get points. It's defensive enough to take hits. Even with Stealth Rocks up, obviously it doesn't appreciate them, but it can survive. Looking at the matchup, though, the clash between A-Drive and Lars has always been a spectacle that I look forward to each season. Whether it's Victini vs Druddigon or Victini vs Mr. Man, the battles are always close, back and forth, enjoyable to watch, and insanely unpredictable. This time around, Lars lacks both Druddigon and Landorus Incarnate. However, Dan still holds onto his signature mon Victini. I imagine that this week, Lars may use Rotom Heat to try to counter Victini, as with the right spread, Rotom can stand its ground against it, and some of the other mons that A-Drive has on this team, like the Clefable, and even like a Scald from the Toxapex probably isn't doing too much, and it can give the Rotom a chance to start getting some points. Moving on, we have Slowbro. Our last week All-Star is making another appearance on my list because Crimson just has a knack for getting All-Stars and high-scoring fantasy mons. Almost every week, Crimson is at the top of the rankings. It's like whether he wins or loses, he just happens to get a lot of points in the Fantasy League. Now, I imagine that this week will be no different as he faces the Alola, Athletic, and Callum. Callum has some strong physically offensive threats like Tyranitar, Crobat, and Excadrill, who all have the capability of hitting Slowbro with super effective hits, racking up those sweet defensive points. With the Regenerator ability, as we saw last week, this is a monster of a wall that can take hits again and again while maintaining healthy amounts of HP while doing so. Our final pick is Suicune, as it's one of the few resist to Mamoswine this week. Not only that, but it can score some resisted hits or super effective hits from almost all of the Gators' offense. That being said, George has made it a point that he'd like to have a more offensive Suicune this season. However, I feel it may be necessary to run a defensive or at least a bulkier set going against the Gators, which may result in this Suicune scoring some defensive points. I'd like to close this GBA Fantasy video with thanking everyone again for participating. Make sure you participate again in week 6. Click the form linked below in the description and let me know in the comments down below or on the GBA Fan Discord linked in the description about how well you did and what picks you're going to make next week. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Kiddings, bye.